Okay, so now I'm going to show you a demo of getting up to speed using the Web API. I'm going to go to Visual Studio. I'm using Visual Studio 2012, but if you are on 2010, everything I'm showing you should work pretty much the same. I'm going to go ahead and go to Visual C# and Web Projects. And I'm going to go ahead and put this project in a place that I can put it up for you guys later on the site. I'm going to go ahead and call this Hello Web API Demo. Now notice the template I picked was an empty ASP.NET website. As I said in the lecture part of this module, you can use the Web API from any ASP.NET application, and of course you can self-host it as well. Getting the Web API into your project is as easy as going to NuGet. So I'm going to right-click on the project and go to Manage NuGet Packages. I'm going to go online and just search for Web-API. And this NuGet package, Microsoft.asp.NET.Web API, is the package I can install. It will install all of the assemblies that I need. So essentially, sort of automatically into my project, gives me all the pieces I need in order to be able to use the Web API. I have to accept the agreement. And after this is installed, I can close the NuGet window. And if I look at my references, you can see that I've got a number of references that were added under system.net and system.web.http and http.webhost. So that's where the Web API infrastructure lives. So I'm going to go ahead and add a new class to this project. And I'm going to call it Hello API Controller. Again, the convention inside of ASP.NET hosting, and we'll talk more about this throughout the course, is that you're going to have a controller class that's going to derive from a base class called API Controller. That is in the system.web.http namespace. And I'm going to go ahead and add a method. So I'll add a method that returns a string. The method name will be get. And I'll say return hello from API at. And then I'll add datetime dot now dot toString, just so we can see that it's actually executing it. Okay, so now I have the convention part of the setup done to use the Web API. But the other part that we need to use the Web API is the ASP.NET routing. So we've got to tell the ASP.NET routing infrastructure that based upon some URL coming into this website, we want that URL to resolve to this particular controller. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and add a global.asax to this project. And inside of the global.asax application start, I'm going to go ahead and modify the configuration. So I'm going to go to global configuration, which is a class that's also in system.web.http. And I'm going to go to configuration, which is the static sort of Uber instance of the configuration for the Web API. And I'm going to go to routes, and I'm going to say add. I'm going to add, I'm just going to call it default. It doesn't matter what I call it. And I'm going to add a new HTTP route. This is in the system.web.http.routing namespace. So the route, there's a number of different overloads. I'm just going to use the overload right now that takes a route template. And so I'm going to use a typical route template that's very common if you've, should look very familiar if you've ever done ASP.NET NVC or anything like that. And so what this is done, it's basically said, hey, I'd like to add a new route with the name of default, and here is the route information. So what ASP.NET Routing is going to do when it sees a request come in that matches this particular pattern, it's going to route it to the appropriate controller, which in this case will be my Hello API controller. So that build succeeded. I'm going to go ahead and right click and say View in Browser. Now I get a forbidden, but what I really want to do is I really want to do /hello API. If I go over to Fiddler, which I have running, which I highly recommend that you go to fiddlertool.com and download Fiddler if you already don't have it. If I go look at Fiddler and look at the raw response, I can see hello from API at this particular time and this particular date. The other cool thing about Fiddler for testing the web API is if I drag and drop a request over to the Composer tab, I can execute this request over and over and over again, or execute additional requests by changing the verb from get to post or put or delete. I can change the URI. And this system, let me just add one more thing to this particular project before I move on to another project. I'm going to add another class. I'm going to call this second controller, just to demonstrate the nature of the route. I'm again going to derive this from API controller. And do another public string get. I'm not going to return anything interesting, just this is the second controller. So build succeeded. Now I can go back over here, and if I replace hello API with second, you can see that I get a response that says this is the second controller. So that first part of the URL is matched against the routing. The name of the URL, that path segment, is taken, and then they resolve that looking for a class called whatever that replaceable token is, controller. So hello API controller, second controller, and that's how the routing works. Now let me do one other thing over here in Fiddler since I'm here, is notice that the accept header here, in terms of content negotiation, basically says text HTML, application HTML plus XML, and then /star/star. Sorry. That basically means I would like HTML first, XHTML second, and then anything. Now, what if I wanted specifically XML? Remember I said content negotiation for XML and JSON work automatically inside of ASP.NET Web API. So if I change the accept header to application XML, if I look at a response then, notice I'm getting back XML. The headers are going to tell me that the content type is application XML. And if I look at the raw result, we can see there's my XML string. Now, I wanted to start with an empty project just to give you the feel of what are the basic parts that make up using the web API in ASP.NET, and they are the routing and the API controller. They're dependent on each other, right? We need both things in order for the default convention of things in ASP.NET Web API, at least for ASP.NET hosting, to work. Now, I just want to, for completeness, go to New Project and go to NVC4 Web Application. I'm going to call this Hello API Template Demo, because when I pick ASP.NET NVC4 project, one of the templates I get is Web API. So it's going to create a Web API project for me or for you when you run this. And I just want to show you this so that you can see what gets generated by the project template by default and sort of put together the pieces of what I just talked about in terms of the way that this one works. So by default, it adds a controller called the values controller. And now the values controller, notice it has a get that returns an IEnumerable. So that by itself, a get to the root of this, whatever the route is for this controller, will return 2 strings. If I do get on a particular ID, I'll get back a value. If I do put or delete, I can delete or add a value. Now I could make this a little bit more interesting to work with. If I said, let's create a list of strings. And I'm basically going to create a new list of strings here. So var return equals new list of string. And let's go ahead and populate it with the same data that the default template does. And now here, let's say return data. And then the individual get for an individual ID, let's say return data. Let's say the ID is the index. If we do a post, let's go ahead and add a new value. So let's say data.add value. If we're going to do a put, we just replace the value at a particular index. So data I equals to value. And if we were going to remove, let's say data dot remove at index. Okay, so I've just modified the controller a little bit just so that we can play with the different verbs, not just get, but also put, post, and delete. So let's leave that for a moment and just remember that this values controller was added for us automatically when I created this project. And then let's look at the other piece, which is the routing. Now the routing, they don't put in the global.asax.cs anymore. This is true for all NVC projects. They've got a static class called web-api-config.register. And if I look at the app start folder, there's a web-api.config class. So here's this static register method. And notice what the config.routes map HTTP route, this is actually an extension method. So map HTTP route simplifies the code that I showed you in the last part of my demo. And so here we specify the name, the route template, and any defaults. Now notice the route template here starts with API/controller. Some people think that you have to have API in order for this to work, and you don't. You absolutely don't. The reason that you might want to keep this convention of the API/controller that they put into this project type is that if you want some NVC routing to coexist with API routing, it just makes it much cleaner if NVC view routing is done at the root and API routing is done from a /API. That's basically the reason that they have done this. So those are the two things that are a little bit different here. Now, of course, if I right click here and say view in browser, what I'm going to get is something much different than what I got in my simple empty project, because it's talking about web API. So essentially they have this helper page, this nice looking page for you to go get information about the web API, which is useful. I'm going to go ahead and go to API/values. So remember, API/values was the mapping of routes to a particular controller. The API part came from the route template, and the controller part is, of course, replaceable via that pass segment, and then the web API looks for a controller with that name, finds it, loads it, and then returns a result. If we go look at Fiddler, we can see that here is my result. So those are my two values. So now what if I want to do something like I want to get a particular value? So let's go ahead, drag and drop this up here. Let's change the except to be more specific. So let's say application slash XML. And I'm going to say values slash 1. So if I do values slash 1 and then execute, I can get value 2. And if I do values slash 0, which should be the 0 index, I get value 1. And so that's pretty cool. What if I want to add a value? So if I want to add a value, I'd go to the values endpoint. I'd do a post instead of a get. I don't really need an accept header, although I can ask for a particular response type. What I do need is a content type header. So I need to say, what is the content type I'm asking for? And this is actually perfectly valid. I can say, I'm sending you JSON, but I would like XML back. It would be a little odd to maybe do that in real life, but it certainly is possible. So I'm going to go ahead and add a request body. And this is just going to be a simple string. So hello API. And I'm going to go ahead and execute. So I get back a 204 no content, which basically means, it didn't return anything. If I go look at the composer again, and I change this back to a get, I have to remove the content type. I have to remove the request body because you don't send a request body on a get. And execute, I should be able to look, and I should see 3 strings. So string value 1, string value 2, and string hello API. What if I would like to delete one of these? Let's go ahead and delete the first one. So I'm going to say delete /0 and execute. And it's perfectly happy with that. There's no content that returns. And if I change the request back to a get on values, and let's say that I would like JSON now instead of XML, I can look at the response, value 2, hello API. Okay, so there's a simple example demo of doing both. Again, sort of the simple approach from the ground up of the web API in an ASP.NET app, and also sort of exploring the default template a little bit.